welcome you to today's Food for Thought event, the monthly talk series at the ISSP, where Institute members present and discuss their latest research on burning questions at the interface of science, society, and policy. I would like to open today's event with the University of Ottawa's Indigenous Affirmation, and I encourage you to acknowledge the land from where you are joining us today as well. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I'm very excited to introduce today's speakers. Presenting today will be Chelsea Shelley, who is the ISSP's 2022 Fulbright Research Chair in Science and Society, and she's also an Associate Professor of Sociology at the Michigan Technological University. Professor Shelley will be in Ottawa at the ISSP from hopefully mid-August to mid-December this year, and we are very much looking forward to welcoming her. We usually give our Fulbright chairs an opportunity to speak publicly about their research at the ISSP prior to or early on in their time with us to create some opportunity for identifying avenues for collaboration with other members of the ISSP network. So hopefully that may be one of the outcomes of today's talk. Welcome, Chelsea. We are excited to have you. And I will be handing over moderating duties in a moment to Dr. Megan Beatty, who is a postdoctoral researcher with the ISSP member, Professor Karen Hinzer at the Faculty of Engineering. And Megan is part of the SunLab Solar Research Group there, and her research focuses on solar energy and photovoltaics. She is passionate about sustainability and reducing emissions from the energy system, which of course speaks directly to the topic of today's event, namely transitions in socio-technological systems. And Megan has also been collaborating with us here at the ISSP with Positive Energy, the research and engagement program in ISSP's Energy Research Cluster. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to hand it over now to you, Megan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marissa, for your kind introduction. And thank you to the ISSP for inviting me to moderate what I expect is going to be a very interesting session with Dr. Shelley this afternoon. As Marissa said, I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the SunLab Solar Research Group in the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. I'm actually a physicist by training, and I conduct research on solar photovoltaic devices and systems that generate electricity from light. Over the past 6 months, I've also been working with Monica and Marissa in the Positive Energy program, combing through their body of work to identify opportunities for scientists and engineers to engage with energy policy and to help build public confidence and consensus on Canada's path to net zero. Having studied renewable energy primarily from a technical perspective through my research career, I'm very interested in learning more about the social aspects of renewable energy development. In particular, I'm interested in how renewable energy technologies such as distributed rooftop solar could be leveraged to address both sustainability and equity in our future electricity systems. In this light, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Chelsea Shelley, who is an expert in the social aspects of socio-technological systems transitions, such as the renewable energy transition that we're experiencing today. Dr. Shelley is an associate professor of sociology in the Department of Social Sciences at Michigan Technological University. She is also the 2022 Fulbright Research Chair in Science and Society with UOttawa's Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. She received her PhD from the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2013. At Michigan Tech, Dr. Shelley advises and teaches students in the Sustainability, Science, and Society major at the undergraduate level and in the Environmental and Energy Policy program at the graduate level. She is leading a university presidential initiative on sustainability and resilience to help Michigan Tech to be a transformative leader in that space. Dr. Shelley's work is inspired by the belief that technological systems used to sustain residential life structure how humans conceive of their relationship to the natural world and to one another. Her research focuses on the intersection of technological and social systems and she has particular interest in technological systems such as electrical energy services that are used to meet human needs and comforts in residential life. She studies how humans choose to organize access to those systems and the implications of those organizational choices. Her research often explores residential and community scale changes in how people access the services provided by these systems and the associated impacts on the health and well-being of humans and the environment. Dr. Shelley's work is collaborative, transdisciplinary, and community-based, focusing on socio-technological systems transitions as a means of addressing equity, enhancing sovereignty, and engaging in right relations among humans and the more than human beings with whom we share the planet. Her research shines a light on the inequities arising from the socio-technological systems of today and proposes pathways to address those deficiencies in the systems of tomorrow for a sustainable and equitable future. Before I turn things over to Dr. Shelley, I'd like to remind you that her presentation will be about 25 minutes, followed by a moderated Q&A period. Please don't use the chat or raise hand features. Feel free to submit your questions at any time using Zoom's Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I will read out the questions to Dr. Shelley during the question period. Now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Chelsea Shelley.
Okay. Thank you very much, Megan, and thank you all for being here. It's my pleasure to get to speak with you today about the social aspects of socio-technological system transitions. As Megan said, I'm Chelsea, and I'm joining you from the shores of Lake Superior, which look very much not like this photo on this February day. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about who I am and the work that I do. First of all, I'm going to start by saying I'm a Uper transplant. That means I live here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Michigan Tech is highlighted on the map that you can see with the little black circle there. I actually live across that portage on an island in Lake Superior, the Keweenaw Peninsula. And Michigan Tech is in the original and contemporary homelands of what is now called the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. I myself am a descendant of settler colonizers, and Michigan Tech is dominated as a campus by descendants of settler colonizers. And much of my work is done as a learner, in a position of a learner. In the past several years, I have worked with and learned from the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. As a part of my work, my goal is to honor the original inhabitants of this land, to recognize my own role as a visitor to this space, and to actively work to restore right relations among humans and the more than human beings with whom I share this space. So my work is really anchored in a sense of responsibility, and my work is anchored in my sense of being a learner. So while I'm going to talk to you as a sociologist, I'm also talking to you as somebody who's learning and who aims to learn through my work. As an individual human being, I'm also a mom in multiple forms. My husband and I navigate a blended family with children and stepchildren. We are also a foster family, and we often host exchange students. And I'm a sociologist and social theorist by profession and by practice. So while I will never train another sociologist here in my position at Michigan Tech, I work with graduate students in an interdisciplinary policy program. Being a sociologist and being a social theorist really permeates what I do as a professor, but also how I approach my relationship in the world more broadly. So today's conversation is really an opportunity for me to reflect on my own experiences working with communities to pursue renewable energy transitions. You'll perhaps see me talking with my hands as you do in this picture. And the things I'd like to really focus on in my conversation with you all today is, first of all, what is social about technological transitions? What role does a sociologist have in studying technological transitions? And when we center those social aspects, when we look at how are these transitions social, what do we learn about new opportunities and new insights regarding challenges and the challenges to transition? As a part of that learning, I hope we can all reflect on and can consider what are our responsibilities as professionals if we embed these transitions that we study in their social aspects. What do we learn that's new and different, and how does it change our own sense of our responsibilities in our engagement, in our work with the communities that we interact with? And I'm going to try to stay focused on those responsibilities as professionals, recognizing that our responsibilities as humans are really monumental, but our responsibilities as professionals are something that I think we can grapple with today. So when I say that technological transitions are social, what I'm going to talk through today with you are a few specific examples of what I mean. First of all, technologies are social in part because of the services that they provide. So I often study energy technology, and within studies of energy transitions, there's an emergent field of literature, an emergent domain focused on energy justice. And one of the premises of this field, one of the reasons that we can study energy as an issue of justice is by taking a step back and starting with a recognition that human beings don't require electrons. Human beings require the services that are provided by energy. These services include our own comfort in our homes, our ability to communicate, our ability to get from point A to point B. They also structure the way we access health and well-being through the medical field. Really, every aspect of our life is shaped by our need for energy services. And when we can shift our research to thinking about the services that energy provides and the ways that we can provide those services in just and equitable ways, I think we learn new things rather than focusing on the sources of the electrons, thinking about the services that those electrons are providing for humans in terms of their well-being and their comfort. I'm also going to talk about the social aspects of technology in terms of scale and the choices that we make about the scales at which we develop technologies, as well as the forms of organization that structure technologies and technological transitions. Finally, I'm going to talk about how some of the challenges that communities face in engaging with socio-technological transitions, we can turn those challenges on their heads and think about them as opportunities for research and engagement. One of the specific challenges I'm going to spend some time on today is thinking about energy transitions within the context of long-term planning. Socio-technological transitions require long-term engagement and planning. Many communities are facing acute crises where they don't have the capacity to engage with that kind of long-term planning. And so we can think about our own responsibility as professionals and our opportunities to engage with communities as a way to respond to that need, recognizing that the acute crisis of a several-year pandemic is just one of many acute crises that communities are facing, whether it's related to poverty or housing, education, mental health, physical health. Communities have pressing needs, and processes like transitions that require long-term planning can be challenging for communities to engage with. So that's one role that we can play. So many of the lessons that I'm going to talk about today, many of the things that I've learned in my engagement are coming out of a project called the Michigan Community and Anishinaabe Renewable Energy Sovereignty, or MyCares project. This project has involved engaging with multiple communities throughout the state of Michigan and tribal nations. These communities and tribal nations are served by different kinds of utilities, different kinds of organizations to provide access to those energy services. So we have a diverse array of communities and utility actors involved. And the goal of the MyCares project is to really try to understand what are the opportunities and barriers associated with this transition, and what role do communities play in community energy planning. So at the heart of this project is this conceptual framework that you can see here that is based on our tribal nations partners' Anishinaabe teachings of the medicine wheel. So using the language and the insights provided by the medicine wheel to start walking on a respectful and ethical path. We start in the East, we start with what do we care about? We walk through this cycle asking ourselves, what do we care about? What are those core values? How do values influence the choices that communities are making? Then we move to what do we know? What is the current state of knowledge? What are the gaps in the knowledge that we already have? We then move to the West asking what is possible, thinking about what skills and technologies can help to transition. What kinds of opportunities can communities pursue? And then finally, what should we do about it together? And learning from the teachings associated with the medicine wheel, we can recognize that this process is ongoing. This is an ongoing cyclical process where we can be asking ourselves these questions, and that the circle is prioritizing balance across these directions for centered or integrated decision making. So this is an approach that I've taken in work in the past several years. This is some of the learning that I've done by engaging with our tribal nations community partners. I want to add a caveat here, though. Some of the pictures that I'm going to show you in the following slides are from past projects on alternative technology or alternative communities. They are not from Michigan communities and not from this project specifically. But some of these images, as the one that is provided here, my hope is that they're serving as sort of a metaphor to help us talk through the ideas that I'd like to share with you. So this picture is of a water filtration and access system for a very large off-the-grid camping event. And the goal here really is to recognize that people need access to water. They don't need pipes necessarily. What they need is water. So this is providing the service of water provision. And we can use this as an analog, or like I said, a metaphor for thinking about energy services provision. So this is an example of a way for people to access water that's radically different from the way that you or I might in our homes, but it's providing the same service of drinking water. We can take a step back for ourselves and reflect on all of the ways that we rely on energy services to get through the day, to meet our own needs and to meet our comforts, for our own requirements to stay alive, and for all of the ways that we recreate or socialize. All of these things are related to energy services. And another piece of this, when we start to center energy services and the provisioning of just and equitable access to energy services, we can recognize that if these services are things that people require for life and well-being, then questions about justice come in, because questions of justice come in when something is required, but it's also limited in some way. And right now, access to energy services is limited, but they're required for life, for well-being. So instead of asking people, what energy sources do you prefer? For me as a sociologist and a community engaged researcher, I can start by asking what services are a priority in a community. We can start by orienting people to that unequivocal need for services, that these aren't really questions about, do you want this or that, but really we need to provide these services. Access to these services is an issue of justice. How do we do that in a way that aligns with what communities care about and what communities prioritize? And when we center energy services, we see different opportunities and barriers than we would if we were centering sources. This is really the big picture goal, right? So some of the barriers to providing just energy services are about quantity. Can we provide enough with this technology in this location? But many of the barriers to accessing just energy services aren't about technology. They're historical barriers, social barriers, institutional barriers. They're in part about who is at the table for decisions about system transitions, about how we organize access to these services that we all need. And those questions are really critical for thinking about how do we organize access to what people need to live a good life. And embedding energy in the provision of energy services allows us to really grapple with those questions in new ways. So I hope you can follow the metaphor with this picture as well. It would not be for your lack of understanding, but my lack of explanation, perhaps. I'm going to shift to talking about scales and issues of scale in technological transitions. So this image is from an intentional community that when it developed was off the grid. It is now a grid-tied community with its own microgrid, and there's really interesting reasons for that we could talk about if you want to. But recognizing here is a community of 50 or so adults who are meeting all of their electrical energy services needs with production on site, even though they're grid-tied. In this picture, you can see this solar oven in the front here. This is something that they use for baking without any connection to electrons or BTUs. And it's also a community where personal vehicles are not allowed. Everybody is using either community cars or bicycles or feet to get around the community. And this picture is really there to help us problematize and think about issues of scale. So to start with unpacking what do I mean by scale, I think it's helpful to just recognize that for a social scientist like myself, the way that I'm approaching technology means recognizing that technologies are inextricably intertwined with the way that we think about and the way that we are in the world. The technologies that we come to accept as normal or typical, whether that be a flush toilet or a bicycle or a light switch, they shape the way we think about the world. They create an intersection between our habits, the practices we engage in, and our norms, or what we think is normal or typical. And in cultures that have been dominated by very large-scale technologies, as well as very large-scale systems of colonialism and extractivism, we tend to think in certain scales. We tend to think about efficiency in certain ways. We tend to think about ourselves as experts in certain ways. And shifting how we think about scale requires that we question some of those things in ourselves, I would say. When we talk to communities about what they want, and when we talk to households about what they want, and this comes from the work on the MyCares project, but also work interviewing solar adopters, work in other communities on solar energy transitions, what communities want is technologies that work at the community scale. And what homeowners or individuals want is technology that works at the household scale. I've talked to many adopters of solar technology at the residential scale whose goal was to have some energy independence, who then later realized that goal wasn't actualized with simply installing solar panels on a grid-tied home. But the motivator was to have downscaled systems. And one of the benefits of many of the technologies that are available to us for decarbonizing our access to energy services is that they are very flexible in scale. So this is not to suggest that every individual needs solar panels or that we need to totally eliminate utility scale development, but that scale itself is a research question. It's a question that we can be asking in our processes of research and inquiry, rather than assuming that we know the most efficient scale, or rather than assuming that there's only one scale at which we can actually get this job done and decarbonize. We can ask ourselves questions about appropriate scale. And a part of that questioning also involves asking ourselves about the scale of our own consumption and recognizing that a part of the transition is going to require some downscaling of our own access to energy services, what we define ourselves as needing access to live a good life. So that, again, to me, that's just a part of questioning scale as a research question, as a source of inquiry, rather than assuming we know what's right. And the opportunities here are really endless, right? We can be thinking about what communities want in terms of residential or distributed solar. We can be thinking about opportunities for integrating cogeneration in lots of different downscaled systems. And we can also be thinking about what are the motivations for development or transition at different scales, because the motivations might be different across different scales, but none are invalid. The motivations that communities have for the systems that they choose to adopt, we have to see those motivations as reasonable and valid in their own right. And questioning scale and our own assumptions about scale is one way to do that. The barriers, to me, associated with opening up this question of scale as a research question, as an opportunity for inquiry, is that changing scale changes everything. And so that's the next thing of what I'd like to talk about here. So this image that you can see here was created by a friend and colleague, Elise Matz, as a part of that MyCares project to try to show some of the very complicated and overlapping relationships between communities, sovereign nations, and utility providers. And the summary here really is that provisioning of energy services is organized through a very complex web of institutional actors operating within very complex markets. I'm a sociologist. I understand these things only to the level of meaning that they have for communities. It's really complicated for me, and I've worked in energy for a decade, thinking about these issues from a social science perspective. the big picture kind of takeaway here is that these systems of institutions and markets, utilities and regulators, the distribution companies, and I recognize this is all specific to the United States context and the way that I'm talking about it. These are things that people created, and these are things that humans can change. And the way that these institutional partners or these institutional actors and their configurations work right now sometimes they pose barriers to the kinds of collaborative activity that's really going to be necessary for communities to be able to pursue an energy transition in a way that aligns with what their goals are, with what they care about. So for a community to be able to actualize energy sovereignty and make decisions about energy transitions in ways that are informed by community values and preferences, sometimes that runs up against the barrier of existing institutional structures, existing energy markets. And so again, for me, this is not to suggest that I know the best way to organize access to energy services, but simply to say that the forms of organization can themselves be elevated to research questions. They can be things that we problematize, things that we ask questions about, rather than assuming that these actors and these institutions exist and are going to continue to exist in exactly the form that they have. We can ask questions about what role are they playing in shaping opportunities and barriers, and where are their opportunities for changing how these organizations work in pursuit of transition. And again, this is for me really based on this understanding that communities don't just want electrons. That's not what they're after. They want energy systems that provide benefits. They want access to energy services in ways that are just and equitable. But energy services access can provide a host of other benefits to communities associated with jobs, associated with community pride and a sense of community identity, also associated with reducing economic dependencies for individuals or community scale actors. Communities want to have agency in decision-making, and that might require changing or at least problematizing and questioning in our research the ways that we organize access to energy services. So on this slide, you can see the goal for me is to really talk through this tension that I see in the work that I do between engaging with long-term planning and recognizing the reality of where communities are. The two kind of charts or graphs that you can see there are related to COVID and its impact on tribal nations in the United States. The one all the way on your right, you can see that the most impacted states in the United States were actually tribal nations. The orange there is the most impacted, and we see tribal nations were more impacted than many US states. We can also see that with the COVID death rates by race and ethnicity, where Indigenous Americans, tribal nations members were very highly impacted by COVID. And some colleagues and I published a paper looking at COVID as a way to reveal, to illuminate some of the other kinds of crises that are happening within communities. And again, for me, the point here is really to recognize that as a sociologist, as a researcher who engages with communities, the way that I engage and the way that we engage with communities in transitions really needs to be informed by an understanding that communities are facing their own acute crises, and that these crises, COVID is one example of an acute and ongoing crisis, but some of these crises are acute crises that have been caused by centuries of ongoing colonization, marginalization, exploitation. These aren't things that we can address quickly or easily, but they impact the priorities for the communities that we work with, and that our responsibility as researchers who want to engage with communities, who want to pursue just energy transitions, is to at least to respect that, to honor that, and to recognize that energy planning requires a long-term engagement, and many communities don't have the capacity to engage in those ways. And so then we can ask, what happens to those seats at the table if communities don't have the capacity to participate in long-term planning? where are their voices represented in those processes, and how can researchers help to fill that gap to recognize community needs and priorities and to honor them in those processes, even when communities are too busy facing acute crises and have too much of their capacity pulled into acute issues to be able to address these challenges that really require long-term thinking. So I'm going to try to summarize a little bit for me some of the opportunities and responsibilities that we have that come out of this reflection, this really great opportunity for me to reflect on what I've learned in my work, and where I think that means we can go in the future. And this image here on this slide is highlighting Lake Superior. Part of that is to recognize my own relationship to place and all of our embeddedness in place. Certainly that's one of the many things that I've learned from my ongoing collaborations, is that all knowledge sits somewhere and that all realities are place-based, and that we can honor that by really recognizing the place-based nature of our reality and our relationships. A part of this picture is also my invitation, I suppose, to draw you in consciously to the potentially uncomfortable, like the frigid Lake Superior waters. It might be uncomfortable to think in these ways, or to think really differently about these energy systems or these transitions that we think we know well as experts. So I invite you all to step with me into the discomfort of the position of being a learner, even as we are also knowledge holders. So I want to start by talking a little bit about what it means to me to try to enhance just access to energy services. For me, that means building energy services perspectives into the work that we do. So I'm going to give you one example of a recent project that I've started working on. I am collaborating with some electrical grid modelers who study hazards and vulnerability and the impact on the grid. Again, in the United States context, trying to understand how can we increase grid resilience and how can we increase our understanding of grid level vulnerabilities. And they're engineers who recognize social issues matter, inequity matters. How do we build that into our models? How do we build models that can help us better understand how grid failure is impacting real people? And so the data that we're hoping to use to build into those models are really focused not just on demographics and thinking about the demographic categories that might help us understand vulnerability, but really thinking about what demographic categories might give us insight into the need to access energy services. So for us, that might be thinking about intergenerational households where members have disabilities or health issues that require higher levels of energy services, recognizing that we can use data collection as an opportunity to learn about energy services access, and that shifting our perspective to think about energy services means we might interpret data or the need to collect certain forms of data differently. So again, that's just one example of a project where we're trying to bring that energy services lens into thinking about kind of the engineering of a technological system and how we can improve it. Again, for me, thinking about how we address scale and forms of organization, these are really questions that should be questions, that should be things that we build into our research agendas, that we build into our inquiry, rather than assuming we know from the beginning the appropriate scale or taking for granted the existing forms of organization. And for me, scale and organization are both questions about energy sovereignty. And when I use that phrase, energy sovereignty, I'm really thinking about the rights of communities to make decisions about their energy systems. And if we take seriously that right of communities to make decisions, that doesn't mean that every community is going to adopt solar or wind or be renewable, or that we even get to decide what communities prioritize in their own decision making. And an energy sovereignty perspective, for me, requires that we address scale and organization in our research as research questions that we can problematize. When I think about my own responsibilities for addressing this lack of administrative capacity for long-term planning in rural communities and in tribal nations, as an educator, one partial solution is for me to change my teaching and to change the way that I engage with student research opportunities or student project opportunities to try to address some of this lack of capacity. So for students in our programs at the undergraduate and graduate level, this might look like working with a community on a grant proposal in a grant writing class, right? Maybe you teach a class on professional writing, or maybe your colleagues do, and you can say, hey, here's an opportunity for some real grounded experience with professional writing that will serve a community who doesn't have a grant writer, who doesn't have access to these skills or these knowledges about how to competitively pursue these opportunities. It might look like prioritizing professional master's students who are working on capstone projects that are much more grounded and applied. For me, working in the United States context, that suggests challenges and opportunities for changing the priorities of funding agencies and thinking about how do we balance funding PhD students who are after big picture research questions and funding students who might be pursuing professional or master's degrees who can help to address some of these gaps in the administrative capacity of communities. And for me, it also means when I'm thinking about those funding opportunities, if I can't build in those master's students because that's not the priority of funders, can I think about ways to build in administrative support costs for community partners so that they can make time in their schedules to address some of these needs for transition planning? Can that be a part of a grant activity for that partnership to develop? And for me as an individual, not just a grant writer, I also think about what I count as a part of my own kind of professional responsibilities, particularly for those of us in the privileged position of tenured faculty members. There's some space for us to rethink our job descriptions so that maybe our jobs include development support for proposals that we won't be funded on directly or significantly, but we're supporting communities and their needs. Maybe it's providing some technical support if you're an engineer and a community is trying to figure out how much solar do we need, or how much might this cost us? These things we might have in the past thought about as service as a part of our job, but I think we have the privileged position to address some of this lack of administrative capacity by rethinking our own obligations and our professional opportunities to engage with communities to enhance these transitions that are really social at their core. For me, I think that would be the key takeaway here is to recognize that as we're transitioning energy systems, it is possible, and it's within the realm of potential, that everything about our social systems will need to change too. That means thinking about how much electricity we think is really necessary, how we organize access to our jobs or the other kinds of things that we might consider mobility needs. And it might require changing how we think about our jobs and how we think about ourselves in terms of our engagement with the world and our engagement with the community partners that are really key to being able to provide a just energy transition that gives the services to communities that they need in a way that aligns with those community values and priorities. So I'm really looking forward to questions and the conversation. I want to thank you for your time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can hopefully see you as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. That was a really very interesting presentation, and I think, at least for me, brings a very different perspective from what I'm used to thinking about. So I hope that our audience members appreciated that as well. So just a reminder to the audience, please post your questions in the Q&A using the Zoom Q&A button, and I will bring those questions up with Chelsea. So to I guess kick off the Q&A, first question I'd like to ask you, Chelsea, is I guess historically the energy sector has been very heavily regulated, and energy service providers are often benefiting from regional monopolies. So how do you envision that this might change in the future, particularly in the context of a rapid build out of renewables and potentially expanded and updated grid infrastructure to try to mitigate climate change? How do you envision that those systems might change as we move forward?
Yeah, I think again, from my social science perspective, one great thing is that the sources of energy of the future, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, these can be developed at various sizes, right? So it can be a sort of all of the above approach where we're saying, we're going to question the scale at which we develop, and we're going to recognize that it doesn't have to be these very large scale investments anymore. And maybe we need some of those, but maybe not all of our energy comes that way. And that's really different than what we saw with the energy transition to coal and natural gas, which requires very large scale investment for very centralized power production. That's just how it's organized. I think some of the things that I'm seeing in the US context from tribal nations that are working to increase their sovereignty suggest at least a couple of paths, I suppose. One is that tribes within the United States have always had the right to charge for access for transmission lines for the right of way, but that right was not talked about and is not done very often by tribes in the United States. It's a pretty new thing for them to start to say, you know what, transmission companies, if you're going to send your power through here, we're going to charge you for this access. And that is at least one small thing that will change some of the balance of the costs for those companies, and to think about where they're putting their own investments in the future. I think we will clearly still need the grid operators, but in the United States, separating the grid operation from the energy production at least moves us in the direction of the potential to have very small scale production or aggregated production serving into these systems. I don't want to discount that the challenges are monumental when it comes to the infrastructure that needs to be upgraded, but I think the combination of downscaling in terms of where that energy is provided and where it circulates, and downscaling what we think we need to live a good life provides a lot more potential than right now we're giving ourselves credit for.
Thank you. I guess a follow-on to that would be, what do you envision as being some of the pros and cons versus being off-grid versus grid-tied for a household or for a small community, like what you described early in your presentation?
Yeah. I think so. I'm just going to go back to the example of the solar adopters. People who put solar on their house for the purposes of that energy independence, and then realize that really, if they were tied to the grid, they weren't any more energy independent than their neighbor, because when the grid goes down, their solar doesn't work anyway. That to me almost creates a disservice to the development of that industry, because it's, people see sort of like a failed potential almost, where it's like they thought they were buying into one thing, but really that's not what that system did for them. I think if we could shift some of the conversation around solar or wind or other things to be less about, at least again, in the United States context, less about carbon, less about climate change. These things are really polarized, more about independence, more about local control. There's a resonance there that we're not going to get from talking about carbon or climate. I think the reality of climate change means that we're going to have much more vulnerable systems. And so the downscaling of those systems provides a real benefit when it comes to vulnerability and resilience. And right now, I don't know if that's fitting into anybody's market calculations, right? To think about how much it's going to matter for us to have smaller scale microgrid kinds of systems when we need to be able to respond to these much higher levels of predicted variability and potential causes for outage. I will say, I guess, one other piece in response to that. I have worked in houses and in communities that are totally off grid, completely disconnected from the grid. And I, like many other people, went into those environments as an ethnographer thinking these are going to be people who think about themselves as like wildly independent. And, I'm going to be able to pick all these things apart in that argument. And that's very much not my experience working with people who are really living totally off grid and, who might be seen as that kind of really independent, island of themselves. The people that I have worked with who are living off grid, for them, the motivation is about self-sufficiency as a right. That you have a right to be self-sufficient if you're able to, if that's your priority. And some of our zoning, some of the ways that we write rules around restrictions on private land don't actually actualize that right in every case. And so for them, it wasn't about being independent. It was about recognizing that self-sufficiency is a right that every human should have, and that like we're all better off if people are given the right to take care of their own needs in some way or another, right? And that's about a collective sense of resilience for those people rather than an individual sense. In the case of the community that I mentioned, that's an eco-village that was off-grid and then tied to the grid, a part of their logic for tying to the grid was recognizing the ways that they were depending on the grid despite being off-grid. So, they were riding their bikes into town to use the coffee shop for internet when their own grid went down, and they wanted to internalize that. They were recognizing that they were putting that responsibility on a different electrical system, and they wanted to internalize those needs. It also came at a time where they would have had to pay for a battery upgrade. And so it was, do they want to invest in batteries or do they want to tie to the grid? The way that they have written the rules around that is that they tied to the grid, but they committed themselves to producing twice as much electricity as they need from the grid. So they're tied to the grid, but they're putting in rather than drawing out. And to me, that seems like in some ways a great aspirational goal, right? To say, let's develop these microgrids that are interconnected, but let's focus on making sure that they produce enough electricity for themselves on balance and provide some for their neighbors, because we're all better off when people have what they need.
Thank you. That's an interesting perspective. I've certainly heard I've heard many different discussions around using microgrids to build a more resilient energy system. So it's interesting to hear some of the social aspects of that as well, rather than strictly from an engineering perspective. So I guess moving on to, you've talked a lot about addressing problems on a community scale and meeting the values and the priorities of those community members. Does this framework work if you apply it on a larger scale? Like, for example, if we're looking at the future of Ontario or Canada, or in your context of Michigan or the United States even, can you use this type of a framework, or how does that, how do you address those larger scale problems?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I would go back to that insight and that teaching really, that all wisdom sits in places and that we need place-based solutions. For me, that's just like an unequivocal truth that we need to be working in and learning within place and developing solutions within place. So is there a national strategy that's going to work in the United States context? Absolutely not, because there's all these different places and they're really diverse, and that we need solutions that are developed in place because our realities are lived in place. There's no way around that our reality is situated in a place. I think one of the benefits of this framework is that we can ask things like, what do we care about? And then we can highlight the diversity in what people care about in ways that challenge our own thinking. I live and work in a very rural community. I get asked questions like, what's the rural perspective on alternative energy? And that's not a thing, right? Because rural communities are diverse. And so I think recognizing that asking what do we care about is a way to highlight some of that diversity, and then find the points of similarity or commonality within a particular place. And then creating a patchwork where we're linking places and their priorities and their values in ways that start from the ground up. That would be my sense, is that I don't know that we can think really from those larger scales down to implementation without confronting the reality that all of our knowledge is, all of our sense of who we are, everything about our reality is developed within a place.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I guess related to that in some ways, you've talked a lot about addressing energy sovereignty and energy justice concerns. And I think in some contexts, people will push back against that, saying, like, how can we reconcile that with energy security and energy affordability? So I was just wondering if you could comment on that from your perspective of how those ideas work together or maybe don't work together.
Yeah, I personally, again, coming from a sociologist perspective, I don't see those ideas as in opposition, because right now I don't think we see anything near the true cost of energy. And so to me, a part of it is if we want energy to be affordable, we have to start with what is the real cost of the energy we're producing right now. And we're not there, at least in the United States context. The subsidies and the ways that we're subsidizing the industries that are currently providing the majority of our energy, we don't know what the true cost of energy is. And I think that's a part of this question of how do you get to affordable energy. I think we could collectively, in a community-based way, decide that what we care about is that equitable access, right? That people have access to the services they need, regardless of their ability to pay for it, because energy services are a thing that people need. And so therefore it's a derivative right. And communities could choose to prioritize that. And I actually have an example of that. I worked with a community here in the UP to develop a community solar program. The transmission company came to the community and to researchers at Michigan Tech and said, look, we really want to develop a community solar program, but we've done it in other places without reaching our subscription goals. We want to make sure we do it in a way here that's going to be viable. Can you help? And so we went and engaged with the community and said, what do you want your community solar program to look like to actually meet what you think matters? And what the community told us was, we want you to subsidize the costs for people who can't afford the upfront payment to participate in community solar. We want there to be an on-bill financing option. We want it to be tied to income. We also want it to be tied to efficiency programs so that people who are able to access that, kind of subsidized cost are also required to access the efficiency programs that are available to them. And so that was a community that said, we care about this. We're going to prioritize it in the way that we write the contracts for our community solar program. And they didn't look at it and say, well, $500 a share is too expensive, we're out. They said, okay, that's a lot of money up front. Most people in our community don't have that. How can we reconfigure what this contract looks like to make it work for those members of the community as well?
I really like that answer. That's thank you.
Yeah.
So I have a question here. How do the ideas of local sovereignty and global interdependence in terms of climate change fit together?
Yeah, that's a really big question. It's a really great one. I think so. From my perspective, one of the benefits of emphasizing energy services is that we start to see our relationships, right? I can't access the energy services that I need without somebody else that I've never met doing their job, or many, many, many somebody else's actually. And if we can focus on that rather than, I want reliable electricity, I think we get a better sense of those relationships. And we have to be able to see ourselves as in relationship with the entire world to care about climate change or these global issues, right? We have to recognize that these are about our relationships with humans and more than human beings all over the world. So to me, a part of the idea of starting with local sovereignty is that you can emphasize that relationality and maybe then scale that emphasis up in a way that you can't get to if you just ask a community, do you want to develop solar here? Yes or no, right? Or how do you want this project to be developed for community benefits? So to me, that's a part of, you start the conversation from a perspective that emphasizes those inevitable relationships that are involved in us getting what we want and what we need from the services around us. And hopefully that helps to shift the conversation to recognize that interdependence in a way that other openings to conversations wouldn't, or that other political perspectives wouldn't.
Another question here. In your experience, have you identified access to place-based knowledge and data as a barrier to transition? For example, future climate changes at local scale and local vulnerabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. This is particularly true, at least where I've seen it the most is in data for energy needs, right? So for the tribal nation that I partner with most directly, they're served by 3 different utilities across many, many buildings. If they wanted to even try to get a sense of the load for their own government operations, it would be a very time-consuming process to pull all that information together, and they don't have anybody whose job that is. And so the data access to kind of your own energy demand as a community and what you need, unless you're operating a municipal utility, that kind of information is really hard to find. It's hard to pull together. The questions about local climate impacts and how they intersect with those transition questions are also really interesting. And I have another project that's looking at consumption and how can we shift consumption and what are some effective ways to do that. And that research suggests that those local downscaled climate models are actually way better at getting people to be concerned than the larger models. So there's a reason to be focused on that downscaling or that local information, because if you tell somebody a global temperature change, that's really different than like your house and your community is going to need to pay this much more for air conditioning, right? Because you're going to have this many more hot days. And we can't share that information unless we have models that can generate it. So for me, that's really key. One of my hopes is that in engaging with ISSP and Ottawa, that I can find ways to develop Great Lakes region collaborations that are thinking about the similarities and differences across the Great Lakes region for the ways that we engage communities in transitions, for the way that tribal nations are brought in as partners or not in transitions. And these local scale models are especially important when we're thinking about those impacts of the Great Lakes, right? And how what we expect to see in the future and what's happening now with circulation, temperature fluctuations, and how those impact real people in their real lives.
Thanks, Chelsea. Maybe we can try to squeak in one more quick question here. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the idea of downscaling and what we think we need to live a good life? Do you see evidence of this change happening in society right now? Is this a value change that you're observing? And has COVID triggered a change in thinking here?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I can only answer it from my perspective and my experiences, of course. A part of that comes from working at Michigan Tech, which is an engineering college that is largely serving a population of students who are coming from rural middle-class backgrounds. When I arrived at Michigan Tech as a young female sociologist, to talk about gender inequality was terribly difficult in the classroom. And now, 10 years later, less than, my students arrive in classes ready to have these hard conversations. And I don't know if it's because of what they've been exposed to or their access to media or what the difference is, but I certainly see a shift in the college age students that I engage with, that the things that I used to have to really work hard to unpack, to convince them that America is not a perfect meritocracy while providing all of the data in a social science class to show that. That was really challenging, and now it's not as much. I think we have a real opportunity to engage with younger people who this is very much their lived reality. They recognize this, and we see this in the United States context in employment interest, right? Most young people today say they would rather have a job that feels meaningful than provides a big paycheck. So I think we can start to see that shift a little bit in those data. I think we have a huge opportunity to be engaging with people who, have sort of grown up in swimming in the climate change sea and recognizing that this is real and not something to be debated, to ask these questions about what does it take to live a good life and how can we downscale to get there. I think of that as a part of our responsibility as professionals, is to think about how can we elevate young people into positions of leadership to create these changes, or what barriers stand in their way. At the municipal level, there's a real recognition that a lot of the leadership in the United States municipal level is older, and that it's a challenge to get young people involved, because even our ideas about family have changed over the past several decades. So people who are younger and have young families might not want to attend evening meetings for a volunteer municipal position. So trying to figure out how do we elevate young people who maybe get it, kind of start from a place of understanding these real concerns, to me seems like a way that we can leverage what I see happening, which is a recognition that a good life doesn't always look like more.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Chelsea. Yeah, I think on that note, we can probably wrap up. So thank you so much for an excellent presentation, and I'll pass it off to Marissa for closing remarks.
Thank you, Megan. And I'm very sad to interrupt this really interesting and rich discussion, but it is my absolute pleasure to thank our outstanding speakers today. Chelsea Shelley and Megan Beatty for this very insightful presentation and discussion. Thank you both so much. It's been a real pleasure participating in this event. I would also like to thank the team here at the ISSP for making this event possible, in particular my colleagues Brendan Frank for event planning and Genevieve Dunn for the flawless technological implementation. Thank you both so much. And finally, thank you all for joining us today. If you would like to revisit or share today's discussion, you can access the recording through our YouTube channel, and you'll find the link soon up on our website and social media channels. And finally, I would like to give you some information about next month's Food for Thought event, which will happen on March 31st. And ISSP member Ida Kronakis, who is a full professor in the Department of History, will speak about her research into the research practices, intellectual property designs, and commercial aims, as well as strategic scientific rhetoric of Monsanto, which is a global agricultural company. And the moderator for that discussion will be Masha Guganik and Alex Trebek, postdoctoral fellow on AI and the environment. So to stay up to date with our upcoming events and everything else that's going on at the Institute, please check out the ISSP website and subscribe to our social media channels for more information. Thank you